One of the greatest queens ever to rule over England died on the 24th of March 1603 inside of the walls of Richmond Palace. Elizabeth I had been queen for around 45 years, and she was beloved by her people. She had, during her reign, overseen the defeat of the Spanish Armada, and she had also brutally ordered the execution of her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, who acted as a credible threat to her throne. Elizabeth did pass away without any heirs, and because of this, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, was actually invited from Scotland to take the throne, becoming James I of England, uniting the English and Scottish thrones, which for centuries had been against each other in wars. Elizabeth's death was a great shock to most, as they had never lived in a country with a different person ruling over them, and she was known as Good Queen Bess or Gloriana. But despite her glory and her reputation, Elizabeth I's wishes after her death were not listened to, and specifically her corpse was disembowelled and eviscerated, as was tradition at the time. This is something that the Queen did not want, but it took place anyway. But why did this happen? And to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. At the time, during the Tudor period, after death, monarchs and very high-status people would have their internal organs cut out from their body after death. This was not necessarily ritualistic, and neither was it linked to religion or belief systems, but instead it was done to keep away decay from the remains. For example, the heart of Jane Seymour, the third wife of King Henry VIII, Elizabeth's father, had her heart cut out following death, and this was buried inside of the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court Palace, and her body would be buried inside of a vault in Windsor. It was normal for high-status individuals to have their internal organs removed and buried away from the corpse. After death, physicians would soon get to work doing the embalming process. They washed the body in rose water and other substances and perfumes, and they would then make a large and significant cut into the body. During this time, the doctors would then remove internal organs such as the liver, heart, lungs, intestines, and more, and they did sometimes carry out inspections of the remains. For example, following the death of Edward VI, Elizabeth I's half-brother, Edward's lungs were said to have been in a bad way, and this concluded that he died from a lung condition, possibly tuberculosis. After the internal organs were removed, they were then placed inside of usually lead boxes or caskets. Recently at the British Museum, I came across one of these boxes and containers, and this one belonged to Sir Henry Sidney, the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland during Elizabeth's rule. This small lead box was engraved, and it was just large enough to contain the remains of Sidney's heart. His remains were buried elsewhere, and his heart then somewhere else. After the internal organs were removed and the body cavity was then washed, this was then done to try and keep decay away as much as possible. Some rulers' bodies did rot quickly. For example, Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector, who defeated King Charles I during the English Civil War, had to be buried days after his death inside of Westminster Abbey because of the fact decomposition had kicked in very quickly. Cromwell's funeral still took place weeks later, but the onlookers did not know that inside of the coffin was actually nothing, and Cromwell's body had already been interred. But this was, as mentioned, tradition for rulers and monarchs, especially in England. However, in 1603, as the new year came around, Elizabeth I was not very well. She had seen many of her friends die and succumb to old age and illness, and she must have believed that she was, after all, the great survivor. Many of her loyal ladies had also passed away, and she became incredibly depressed and rather melancholic. She was a shadow of her former self, and the once spirited queen had had enough. She remained in good health up until the final weeks, but it became clear that she had given up and she was in no mood to fight for life anymore. In March of 1603, she had fallen sick, and it was said that she would sit in a settled and unremovable melancholy for hours, unable to be awoken from the depressing trance It was almost as if Elizabeth was beginning to contemplate her life and the sins that she had committed, for example, ordering the execution of Mary Queen of Scots, which she did deeply regret for years afterwards. She became concerned that she would not get to heaven because she had killed someone who had been sent by God to rule over the Scottish people, and even in her final moments this greatly troubled her. Elizabeth I was almost 70 when she was on her deathbed, and she was accompanied by her closest friends and servants when she was then attended on by the Archbishop of Canterbury. He offered the Queen spiritual guidance, and he told her that she would rule again in heaven as a queen, but her close friends who had died in the months before were in her thoughts, and Elizabeth believed she would one day see them again in the afterlife, and she was told to hold God in her thoughts who would guide her through. However, the Queen's throat swelled and she struggled to speak, and because of this many knew that death was coming. But inside of her private bedroom in Richmond Palace, Elizabeth I died, and she had left instructions as to what to happen to her remains following her death. Elizabeth, however, following her death stipulated that she did not want to be embalmed, and she did not want her remains to be cut open and eviscerated in any way. She found this process repugnant and vile, and Elizabeth stated against everything that she did not want this to happen. But for some reason, against the wishes of the deceased queen, the royal physicians and doctors, full well knowing this was against her demands, went ahead with the embalming process, and they cut a large cavity into her body and removed her internal organs, including her heart, her lungs, intestines, and other parts of her body, and then washed out the large hole where these had once been with rose water and other perfumes. She was embalmed in exactly the same manner as many other kings and queens had been, despite the fact she did not want it. But it was probably a good thing that the doctors did not take notice of the Queen's beliefs. You see, when the coffin was travelling on the funeral procession to Westminster Abbey, there was a loud crack which was heard coming from inside of the coffin. Elizabeth's body had been wrapped in many layers of cerecloth to preserve it, and at some point on the journey, possibly caused by movement of the hearse, some gases came out of her body and caused an explosion. The loud crack led to even some of the coffin being splintered and damaged, but if the royal doctors had not have embalmed the Queen and removed her vital organs, there was a good chance that the explosion could have been much worse, as gas was expelled from the corpse, and it could have caused further damage and shattered the coffin. It was claimed on the funeral procession that the city of Westminster was surcharged with a multitude of all sorts of people in the streets, houses, leads and gutters that came to see the obsequies. There was such a general sighing, groaning and weeping as the like has not been seen or known in the memory of man. Elizabeth I was later laid to rest inside of Westminster Abbey, and she was first interred inside of the same burial vault as her grandfather, Henry VII, and her grandmother, Elizabeth of York. But James I, her successor, would later have a huge tomb made for her above her half-sister Mary I's remains, and Elizabeth I was buried there inside of the vault above her half-sister. But the lead box containing the Queen's heart was also placed inside of the vault, and shockingly, years later, a young boy would actually open the box and touch the heart of Elizabeth I. This boy was working inside of the abbey when he went snooping in the vaults, and he opened the box and was said, "Within niches were the urns, one with the name of Queen Mary, the other with that of Queen Elizabeth. I dipped my hand into each and pulled out of each a king of gluttonous red substance, somewhat resembling mortar. Mary's urn contained the least moisture." The disembowelment of Elizabeth I and the removal of her internal organs after her death was controversial. It was against the wishes of a woman who had ruled over England for decades, and her wishes should probably have been respected, but during the funeral procession, further damage to the coffin was prevented by the embalming process. Her remains had been cut open and her internal organs had been removed, and with this they were then placed into separate vessels, but they were not, it's presumed, buried somewhere important to Elizabeth, and instead remain inside of the vault in Westminster Abbey to this day. despite being touched by a boy centuries later. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.